Hello guys, welcome to the first video in our Diablo 4 series, and today we're going to be looking at the essential things you should know before getting started on your D4 journey. Keep in mind, some of these tips are going to be based on the idea of efficiency, and if you're the type of player who just wants to explore or theorycraft at your own pace, that is both fine and encouraged, but for those looking to navigate the levels 1 to 50 experience as efficiently as possible, there are a number of ways to help you do that. Firstly, if you do fall into the latter category, I would advise getting a general idea of what kind of build you're going for between levels 1 to 50 and taking note of what legendary aspects are fundamental to that build and where they can be obtained early on. For example, I'm going to be running a Twisting Blades Rogue build, and I know the first thing I'm going to want to do is grab the Blade Dancer's aspect. I have a map which I'll link in the description and talk about a little bit later on in the video that shows me exactly where I can obtain this aspect, and as soon as the tutorial is over and I'm able to traverse the open map, I'm going to head straight to that dungeon, obtain the legendary aspect, which will also unlock the occultist before returning back to the Fractured Peaks and imprinting that aspect onto a very specific piece of gear. Which brings us to the legendary aspects and how we should be managing cost efficiency whilst leveling. As I'm sure many of you know, when it comes to legendary aspects, depending on the type, they will be slot specific, and certain slots offer different modifiers, such as a two-handed weapon slot giving you a 2x modifier and your amulet giving you a 1.5x modifier. So whilst the end game your core offensive aspect would ideally be placed on a two-handed weapon for that 2x modifier, it's not going to be efficient for leveling, as your weapon is your main source of damage increase and you're going to be constantly replacing that weapon every time you find an upgrade, and you can't be replacing the aspect every time that you do, which is why most people would recommend placing it on an amulet, which is far less of a priority in terms of upgrading regularly. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that if you factor in your class and build. For example, a Sorcerer, a Druid, a Necromancer or a ranged rogue are definitely going to want to utilize this method for placing your core aspect on your amulet. However, for a melee rogue or a barbarian, you do have that option to use that two-handed weapon as a stat stick. In the case of the rogue, the core damage stat on the bow or crossbow has no effect on your melee skill damage, and the only thing that matters are the secondary stats on it. As with the barbarian, a two-handed weapon type that you don't intend to attach to any active skills that you're using, this weapon can sit in your equipped inventory as a placeholder for that 2x modified legendary aspect, freeing up that amulet for another aspect. Now let's say you have several offensive aspects that you want to utilize, and you're a sorcerer or any of the other classes that can't afford to utilize a two-handed weapon for their aspect. You've placed your core aspect on your amulet, but there's another two offensive aspects that you want to equip. Well, because you can only place offensive aspects on weapons, gloves, amulet or rings, this will leave us with either gloves or rings as our next available slot. In this situation, you'd want to prioritize gloves for a second offensive aspect. This is because with your rings, they're generally where you're going to want to place your resource related aspects, and most if not all builds are going to want to run at least one resource based aspect. If you really want that third offensive aspect, you could put it on one of the rings and then run a single resource aspect, but for anyone wondering why we wouldn't just put a second resource aspect on the helm, as resource aspects can be placed on rings, amulet and helm, the answer is, like the other remaining armor slots, your helm is going to be something that you're perpetually upgrading as you find new pieces, due to the fact that as you level, enemies scale to your level, and if you're not regularly replacing those armor pieces, it won't take long for you to become, at least defensively, undergeared against those enemies. There are also other factors such as the stats that can roll on armor pieces, especially plus X to specific skills. Now this might get a little bit complicated and warrant a separate video, but just as a hypothetical example, you're running a Hydra build Sorc and a helm drops with +1 to Hydra. In the game we have what's called item power breakpoints, which can give you the opportunity to re-roll the stat range for that skill via upgrading. Now I'm not talking about enchanting where we manually re-roll a specific stat, but upgrading a piece of armor that takes that item into the next tier of item power. For example, your helm with +1 Hydra is 335 item power. That's 5 item power away from the next breakpoint or tier of item power. So you could go to the blacksmith and upgrade this item one time, which would add that 5 item power you need to take you into the next tier of item power, which would re-roll the stat range on that item, increasing the higher potential value for that roll, which also works for +X to skills. So you could, theoretically, with this upgrade, turn your +1 Hydra into a +2 by upgrading. due to the item power moving into the next tier. Now I know that's a little bit complicated and convoluted and probably requires an expanded explanation on how item power breakpoints work, but the point I'm trying to make is, along with your main weapons, your helm, chest, legs and boots are items that are likely to be replaced regularly during the leveling process. So if you really wanted to imprint an aspect onto one of those pieces, at least make sure you've got a piece that has the ideal stats and a plus X to a core skill. Now onto gold and materials, which are going to be a very precious resource when it comes to optimization later in the game. You do not want to be in a position where you're forced to target farm gold or materials when it's time to start that optimization process. Speaking of which, in terms of gold and material management, I would advise that at least for the first 30 levels or so, not to sell anything, but to just salvage everything that you don't intend to keep. From the get-go, gold is going to be coming from multiple sources, monsters, events, quest rewards, etc., whereas materials primarily are just going to be coming from everything that you salvage. Now later on in the game, I personally might start to incorporate a split method where I set a specific number for sale, i.e. I have a full inventory, anything over 2k sell price I mark as trash, I head to the vendor, I'll sell all trash and then salvage everything else. But this won't be until much later in the game, as sell prices of items will go up over time, whereas the material quantity won't. But for the most part, you definitely want to prioritize salvaging. Next, you want to be keeping on top of the spending of your obals, particularly as early on you will be limited on obal capacity. Now initially in the betas there was a whole thing about the best way to spend obals, particularly around what kind of legendary aspect you wanted to obtain. Then they nerfed the cost of gloves, which at the time was the most efficient way to try and target farm offensive aspects. But honestly, that whole gambling process was just because we were in a beta and we weren't able to obtain specific aspects outside of the fractured peaks from dungeons. Now that we can, I would just recommend using your obals on rings to try and get those resource based legendary aspects which you won't need to replace for a while. In general, obal gambling will be something we revisit towards the end of the game when we're target farming higher roll values on specific aspects. Speaking of which, make sure in your settings you turn on advanced tooltip information and advanced tooltip compare, which display important information that should be standard, including the ranges that a specific stat can roll within. Another thing I highly advise you turn on is force move and assign it to an easily accessible key, as it is not only a massive quality of life feature, avoiding the frustration of accidentally clicking on an enemy when you want to move, but it will actually save your life in certain situations, like on Ashava. She has that ability where she swipes her blades behind her and you're safe if you stand in the center. Well, with force move you can easily position yourself there with no problems, but without it it's very easy to accidentally click on a Ashava when you're trying to position yourself and you just end up getting hit. So I would definitely turn this on and assign a keybind to force move. On the subject of world bosses, make sure you're regularly checking the map for the spawn timers, as you really don't want to miss them, especially when it's your first time killing that particular boss, as you will be rewarded with a grand cache for doing so, which will contain multiple legendary items. And don't forget, if you're playing on T2 difficulty at the start, as of right now there's no disadvantages to just knocking down the difficulty to T1, so I would recommend that if you wanted to guarantee that first kill and get that cache. Now I know there's been a lot of debate on T1 versus T2 for leveling efficiency, and personally I'll just be playing on T2 from the get-go, not only because I'm playing a class and build that I know can move through it quite fast regardless, but also I don't really like the idea of jumping from T1 straight into T3 later on, which could be a bit jarring. Now if I was playing a Druid or a Barbarian that are known to struggle a little bit more in the early game until they get their core aspects and their build going, then I would definitely consider knocking it down to T1, because essentially you're not gaining any benefit from doing T2 in that situation. The 20% XP doesn't mean much when it's taking you that much longer to clear content than it would on T1, and as it stands there isn't any benefit in terms of loot drops on T2, so if you really just want to be efficient, consider playing on T1 if you're finding T2 a bit of a slog early game. Remember that at levels 10 and 20 you want to upgrade your potion at the Alchemist, and remember to pick up your class specific quest, which for most classes should unlock around level 15, and you definitely don't want to forget to do this, as it will unlock your class's specialization, which you ideally want to get as soon as you can. Now I also want to talk about Lilith Shrines and when you should go for them. You are going to want to go for them before entering T3 and hitting level 50. Beyond the obvious, such as the mass amounts of secondary stat increases you're going to be getting from them, especially for stats that you wouldn't necessarily be prioritizing on your main gear but still have immense value, you're also going to be farming renown, which is massively important, rewarding you everything from skill points to potion charges. But on top of that, certain zones, specifically in the western region of the map, appear to even offer you several paragon points, which means you'll have something to invest in the paragon board the moment you hit 50. Now in terms of when to go for these shrines, I plan on dedicating time to it some point between obtaining my mount but before level 50. You definitely don't want to go for this before you get your mount, but you also want to have explored most of the regions and got yourself most of the gateway waypoints for easy travelling. Both Diablo fans and Fixture Life have an interactive map that will show you where you can obtain all of the Lilith Shrines and dungeons that contain aspects, which I will link in the description. I may make some leveling builds for Rogue if anyone is interested in my take on them. You're welcome to join our Discord where we have dedicated channels for Diablo, grouping up, trading, or just general chat. Links will be provided in the description and pinned comment. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up, and if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing for more Diablo 4 content coming soon. Okay guys, until next time, take care.